What if I told you that everything you've learned about African greatness is incomplete? What if the history you've been told purposefully omits the most powerful, oldest, and most sacred kingdom that ever existed on the African continent? Prepare yourself, because what you're about to discover in the next few minutes will turn everything you were taught in school about ancient Africa upside down. There is a kingdom that has been deliberately erased from history books, an empire that built pyramids before Egypt became the Egypt we know, a civilization so spiritually advanced that its kings were considered living gods and its temples held cosmic secrets that scientists are still trying to decipher. This kingdom was called Kush, and it was Kush, not Egypt, that dominated the Nile for millennia, that created the foundations of African spirituality, and that established standards of astronomical, mathematical, and architectural knowledge that influenced the entire ancient world. But why have you never been told this? Why, when you think of African pyramids, do you only think of Egypt? Why, when discussing powerful pharaohs, is it that no one mentions the black kings of Kush, who conquered and ruled Egypt itself for almost a century? The answer is more disturbing than you might imagine. For centuries, European historians deliberately minimized, distorted, and even erased evidence of Kushite greatness, because acknowledging Kush would mean acknowledging that the most advanced civilization of antiquity was black, was purely African, predating what they wanted the world to believe. Kush was not just a kingdom, it was the cradle of African spirituality, the source of sacred knowledge later absorbed by Egypt, the empire that built more pyramids than any other civilization in human history. More than 250 pyramids still stand in present-day Sudan, silent witnesses to a glory that has been systematically ignored. And today, you will learn this truth. You will understand why Kush was the true spiritual heart of Africa, why its temples were portals of cosmic connection, and why this history has been hidden from you all your life. Now tell me something honestly. Have you ever stopped to question why in school they only taught you about Egypt when they talked about great African civilizations? Have you ever wondered why it seems that ancient Africa begins and ends at the pyramids of Giza? Well, that's exactly what they want you to believe. But the truth is that south of Egypt, on the upper banks of the Nile River, flourished a kingdom so ancient, so powerful, and so spiritually advanced that it made Egypt itself tremble. This kingdom was called Kush, also known as Nubia, and its history is so impressive that it has been deliberately erased from school curricula around the world. Why? Because recognizing Kush would mean recognizing that Black Africa was not only the cradle of humanity, but also the cradle of the most sophisticated civilization of antiquity. In the next few minutes, you will discover secrets that have been kept for millennia, archaeological truths that have been hidden, scientific evidence that has been ignored, and a spiritual history so profound that it will completely transform your view of Africa, of spirituality, and of the origins of human knowledge. You'll understand why the Kushites built more pyramids than the Egyptians, why their kings were considered direct intermediaries between heaven and earth, why their queens ruled with absolute power in a time when the world was dominated by men, and especially why all of this has been systematically erased from official history. This video isn't just about ancient history, it's about recovering a stolen truth, reconnecting you with severed spiritual roots, and showing that African greatness goes far beyond what Hollywood and traditional documentaries want you to know. So if you truly want to understand the real history of Africa, if you want to discover the sacred kingdom that was forbidden in the books, like this video now because this knowledge needs to be spread. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos where we'll delve even deeper into these mysteries. And above all, stay until the end, because the most impactful revelation is saved for the last few minutes. Let's begin this journey to the truth. When we talk about Kush, we first need to understand where and when this kingdom arose because its geographical location itself reveals much about its strategic and spiritual importance. Kush was located south of Egypt, in the region we now know as Sudan, stretching along the Nile River from the First Cataract to well beyond the Sixth Cataract. This position was not accidental. It was absolutely strategic because Kush controlled the most important trade routes of antiquity, routes that brought gold from Central Africa, incense from Arabia, ivory from the African savannas, and precious stones from the richest mines on the continent. Kushite gold was so abundant and of such superior quality that the very name Nubia comes from the word nub, which means gold in the ancient language. Imagine the wealth accumulated by a kingdom that had direct access to the largest gold reserves in the ancient world. But Kush was not only rich in material resources, it was infinitely richer in spiritual knowledge and cosmic wisdom. The Kushites developed a profound understanding of celestial cycles, sacred mathematics, divine geometry, and the universal laws that govern existence. They observed the stars not only to mark time, but to understand the cosmic patterns that influence life on Earth. Their pyramids were not just tombs. They were spiritual antennas designed with mathematical precision to channel cosmic energies and facilitate the soul's journey after death. And here's something that will surprise you. Kushite pyramids are steeper, more angular, and in many ways more architecturally sophisticated than Egyptian pyramids. They were built with an incline of approximately 70 degrees, creating structures that seemed to point directly to the sky, as if they were stairways to the gods. Modern archaeologists have counted more than 250 pyramids still standing in the region of Ancient Kush, a number far greater than the pyramids existing in Egypt. Let that sink in for a moment. Kush has more pyramids than Egypt. But when you think of African pyramids, which country comes to mind first? Exactly. This is no coincidence. It's the result of centuries of biased historical narrative. The Kushite civilization dates back to at least 3000 BC, with archaeological evidence suggesting that organized communities existed in the region long before that. During its peak, Kush not only rivaled Egypt, but frequently surpassed it in military power, economic wealth, and cultural sophistication. The Kushites developed their own script called Meroitic, which has not yet been fully deciphered by modern scholars, meaning that entire texts, complete inscriptions, and historical records remain illegible to us. Imagine how many secrets are still locked away in these ancient writings, how much spiritual and historical knowledge we have yet to access. Kushite social organization was remarkably advanced, with a structure that included a divine king called Kor, a powerful queen mother known as Kandake who often wielded real political power, and an extremely influential priestly class that guarded the spiritual mysteries of the kingdom. The Kandakes of Kush were warrior queens who led armies, negotiated with foreign empires, and ruled with absolute authority. There is even a fascinating record of a Kandake named Amenarrenas, who confronted the Roman Empire itself in the 1st century BC, personally fought in battles, lost an eye in combat, and forced the Roman Emperor Augustus to negotiate a peace treaty favorable to Kush. That's right, a black African queen defeated Rome in battle and forced the most powerful empire in the world to retreat. But this story is rarely told in Western school textbooks. Why? Because it challenges the narrative that Africans were primitive, that women were weak, that only Europeans built great civilizations. Kush defies all of that, and for that reason has been systematically erased. The Kushite religion was deeply connected to cosmic and natural forces. They worshipped Amun, the hidden god who represented the invisible creative power of the universe, Isis, as the great divine mother and protector of life, and a variety of local deities who personified aspects of nature and human consciousness. But Kushite worship was not superficial. It was a sophisticated spiritual practice involving complex rituals, secret initiations, and meditative practices designed to elevate consciousness and connect the practitioner with higher dimensions of reality. Kushite temples were built following principles of sacred geometry, astronomically oriented to align with specific celestial events, such as solstices and equinoxes. Within these temples, priests and priestesses performed ceremonies that combined chanting, dancing, offerings, and altered states of consciousness to facilitate communication with the divine. These practices were not primitive or superstitious. They were highly developed spiritual technologies based on a profound understanding of the nature of consciousness and reality. Now let's talk about something that will blow your mind. Kush not only influenced Egypt, Kush conquered and ruled Egypt during a period known as the 25th dynasty or Nubian dynasty. This happened around 750 BC when the Kushite kings marched north, conquered all of Egypt, and proclaimed themselves the rightful pharaohs. For almost a century, the black pharaohs of Kush ruled an empire that stretched from the borders of present-day Ethiopia to the Mediterranean. These Kushite pharaohs did not destroy Egyptian culture. On the contrary, they presented themselves as restorers of ancient Egyptian traditions that had been corrupted and forgotten. They rebuilt temples, revitalized ancient religious cults, patronized the arts, and became some of the most devout and traditionalist pharaohs in Egyptian history. The most famous Kushite pharaoh was Piye, also known as Pianki, who left a monumental stele describing his conquest of Egypt. In this inscription, Piye does not boast of destruction or massacre, but of religious piety and justice. He describes how he purified Egyptian temples, restored ancient rituals, and brought divine order back to Egypt. Another notable Kushite pharaoh was Taharqa, who is even mentioned in the Bible in the Book of Kings as a powerful king who defied the Assyrians. Taharqa built magnificent monuments in both Egypt and Kush, expanded the empire, and sponsored a cultural renaissance that produced some of the most exquisite works of art of antiquity. But here's the part they want to hide from you. When the Assyrians finally expelled the Kushites from Egypt around 660 BC, the Kushites did not disappear. They were not destroyed. They simply returned south and continued their own independent civilization that would last for another 1,000 years. While Egypt changed hands, conquered by Persians, Greeks, and Romans, Kush remained independent, strong, and culturally vibrant. The Kushite capital was moved from Napata to Meroe, a magnificent city that became a center of trade, industry, and learning. Meroe was famous for its iron production, having developed such an advanced metallurgical industry that the city has been called the Birmingham of ancient Africa by modern archaeologists. Mountains of slag, the residue of iron smelting, can still be seen around the ruins of Meroe, testifying to the industrial scale of Kushite metallurgical production. This means that while many parts of the world were still in the Bronze Age, Kush had already completely mastered iron technology. Think of the implications of this: superior iron weapons, more efficient agricultural tools, more durable buildings. All of this gave Kush a significant technological advantage. But beyond material technology, Kush developed a unique spiritual culture that synthesized Egyptian influences with older, deeper African traditions. The Kushites believed that their kings were literally sons of the gods, divinely chosen even before birth. Royal succession did not simply follow hereditary lineage, but involved a process of divine selection where the god Amun supposedly indicated the next king through oracles and mystical signs. Imagine a political system where the leader is not chosen for military power or family wealth, but for spiritual consideration, for a perceived connection with the divine. This was the Kushite ideal, even if in practice human politics certainly played its part. Women in Kush had an extraordinarily high status compared to other ancient societies. The Kandakes were not just queen's consort, they were rulers in their own right. They led armies into battle, negotiated international treaties, built monuments, and were buried in pyramids as grand as those of the kings. Relief images show Kandaks dressed for war, wielding weapons and trampling defeated enemies. These were not symbolic representations. They were portraits of real warrior queens who literally fought alongside their soldiers. Kushite art had a distinctive style that combined Egyptian elements with unique African sensibilities. Kushite statues often depict people with pronounced African facial features, more robust bodies, and proportions different from idealized Egyptian representations. This shows cultural pride, a visual affirmation of African identity that refused to simply copy Egyptian patterns. The Kushites were saying through their art, "We are different, we are African, and our beauty is our own." Kushite religious architecture evolved beyond Egyptian models. Meroitic temples incorporated unique elements such as columned kiosks, open courtyards, and decorations that blended Egyptian motifs with local Kushite symbols. Kushite pyramids, while inspired by Egyptian ones, developed their own distinctive style, steeper, smaller in size but greater in number, often built in clusters that created impressive necropolises. The most remarkable of these necropolises lies in a place called Bagrawiya, where dozens of pyramids still stand in the Sudanese desert, a silent but powerful testament to Kushite grandeur. But here's something truly fascinating. Despite all this grandeur, despite all this archaeological evidence, Kush remains largely unknown outside of specialized academic circles. Ask 10 people on the street about African pyramids, and 9 will only mention Egypt. Ask about great warrior queens of antiquity, and they will mention Cleopatra, who was Greek, not Black African. But they won't know Amanirenas or Amani-Shaketo, who were genuinely African Kushite Kandakes. The reason Kush has been systematically erased from popular historical consciousness has deep roots in European colonialism and the scientific racism of the 18th and 19th centuries. When European explorers and archaeologists began discovering Kushite ruins in Sudan, they simply couldn't accept that black Africans could have built something so sophisticated. So they created absurd theories to explain Kush without giving credit to Africans. Some claimed that Kushite pyramids were merely inferior copies of Egyptian ones, ignoring that the Kushite style was distinct and that many Kushite pyramids were built long after pyramid construction had ceased in Egypt, showing an independent cultural continuity. Others suggested that Kush was created by light-skinned Egyptian colonists, a theory completely refuted by archaeological and artistic evidence that clearly shows the Kushites as black Africans proud of their identity. There were even those who proposed that Kush was founded by Phoenicians, Greeks, or other Mediterranean civilizations, anything to avoid acknowledging the creative and intellectual capacity of black Africans. These racist theories dominated Egyptology and Nubian studies for decades, distorting the popular understanding of Kush. Even today, when the evidence is overwhelming and indisputable that Kush was a black African civilization of immense power and sophistication, the kingdom remains marginalized in educational curricula. In world history textbooks, Kush receives perhaps a paragraph, perhaps a footnote, while contemporary civilizations like Greece and Rome receive entire chapters. This disparity is not accidental. It is the result of centuries of Eurocentrism that places European civilizations at the center of the historical narrative while marginalizing African, Asian, and American contributions. But the truth cannot be hidden forever. Modern archaeology is revealing more and more about Kush, and each discovery confirms what African scholars have argued for decades. Kush was one of the greatest civilizations of antiquity, comparable in every respect to Egypt, Mesopotamia, ancient China, or any other civilization you might want to mention. Recent excavations at Kushite sites have uncovered magnificent palaces with sophisticated plumbing systems, temples decorated with vibrant murals that have survived for millennia, metalworking workshops that produced iron on an industrial scale, and royal necropolises brimming with treasures that rival anything found in Egypt. One particularly exciting discovery was made in Meroe, where archaeologists discovered a royal palace with walls covered in colorful images depicting scenes from Kushite life. Royal banquets, religious processions, prisoners being presented to the king, gods blessing royalty. These paintings provide a rare window into the visual world of the Kushites, showing how they saw themselves and how they represented their world. What these images show are proud, powerful, sophisticated people living in a complex and culturally rich society. Another fascinating discovery involves the Meroitic texts. Although the Meroitic script is not yet fully understood, scholars have made significant progress in decoding it. What we do know is that Meroitic is a unique language, unrelated to Egyptian, representing the genuine voice of the Kushite people. As more texts are translated, we are beginning to hear the Kushites speaking for themselves, telling their own stories, expressing their own worldviews, and what they say challenges many assumptions historians have made about them. For example, the Kushites have been found to have a complex system of titles and social positions far more elaborate than previously thought, suggesting a highly stratified society with multiple layers of aristocracy, priesthood, administration, and working classes. The spiritual connection between Kush and the rest of Africa is another fascinating area of study. Many elements of Kushite religion appear in later African spiritual traditions, suggesting that Kush may have served as a dissemination point for religious concepts that spread across the continent. Ancestor worship, belief in a supreme creator deity accessible through intermediary deities, the use of masks and ritual objects in religious ceremonies, the importance of priest-kings serving as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. All these elements found in traditional African religions across the continent have direct parallels in Kushite religion. This suggests that Kush may have been a center of spiritual innovation whose ideas radiated outward, influencing cultures throughout Africa. Some Afrocentric scholars have gone even further, arguing that Kush was the true cradle of Egyptian civilization, that the fundamental concepts of Egyptian religion, architecture, and social organization originally came from Kush before being adopted and adapted by the northern Egyptians. While this theory remains controversial and debated, there is intriguing evidence supporting it. For example, some of the earliest Egyptian dynasties show clear cultural influences from the south, from the Nubian region. The very concept of divine kingship, so central to Egyptian civilization, may have originated in Kush, where it was practiced in an even purer and more intense form. The identification of the pharaoh with the god Horus, the belief that the king was literally a god incarnate, these ideas have their deepest roots in the land south of Egypt. Now let me tell you something that will truly open your eyes to why this story matters today. Kush is not just ancient history. It's a key to understanding modern African identity, a source of pride and inspiration for people of African descent worldwide, an irrefutable proof against racist narratives that attempted to paint Africa as a continent without history or civilization before the arrival of Europeans. For centuries, Africans were taught that their history began with slavery and colonization, that before that, they were merely primitive tribes living in mud huts, contributing nothing to human civilization. This false narrative was used to justify slavery, to justify colonialism, to justify the continued exploitation of the African continent. But Kush completely dismantles this narrative. Kush proves that Africans built powerful empires, created magnificent works of art, developed advanced technologies, organized complex societies, and contributed immensely to the development of human civilization. When you look at the Kushite pyramids rising from the Sudanese desert, when you read about the Kandakes who defeated Roman armies, when you learn about the iron industry of Meroe or the Meroitic script, you are looking at achievements that rival anything produced by any ancient civilization anywhere in the world. And that is precisely why Kush has been erased. To acknowledge Kush is to acknowledge the full humanity, creativity, and intellectual capacity of Africans. It is to acknowledge that Africa is not a backward continent that needs to be civilized by outsiders, but a continent with a rich and glorious history of its own. It is to acknowledge that before there was Greece, before there was Rome, before there were the great European cities, there was Kush with its pyramids, its temples, its palaces, and its spiritual wisdom. For the African diaspora, especially for people of African descent in the Americas whose ancestral connections were severed by slavery, Kush offers something profoundly important: a root, a connection to a glorious past, proof that their ancestors were not merely passive victims, but creators of civilization. This reconnection with pre-colonial African greatness is psychologically and spiritually powerful. It answers the question that haunts many people of African descent: where did we come from? Who were we before slavery? And the answer Kush provides is, you came from kings and queens, from pyramid builders, from iron workers, from poets and priests, from warriors and sages. But here is something crucial that needs to be understood. Reclaiming Kush does not mean falling into exaggerated Afrocentrism or creating false historical myths. We don't need to exaggerate or invent to make Kush seem impressive, because the actual historical truth, based on solid archaeological evidence, is already impressive enough. Kush really did build over 200 pyramids. Kush really did conquer and rule Egypt. The Kandak people truly led armies and ruled with absolute power. Meroe truly produced iron on an industrial scale. All of this is verifiable historical fact, not fantasy or exaggeration. And that is what makes Kush so powerful as a symbol and source of pride. It is not myth, it is documented reality. Young Africans and people of African descent who learn about Kush are not learning comforting fantasies. They are learning their true history, a history that has been systematically hidden from them. Mainstream education continues to fail to adequately teach about Kush and other great African civilizations. Children around the world learn in detail about ancient Greece, about Rome, about the Mesopotamian civilizations, but remain completely ignorant about Kush, about the Mali Empire, about Great Zimbabwe, about Aksum, about all the great African civilizations that existed and thrived. This omission is not accidental. It is a continuation of the colonial erasure that attempted to deny Africa its rightful place in world history. But things are changing. More and more educators are incorporating genuine African history into their curricula. More books are being written about Kush and other African civilizations. More documentaries are being produced. More archaeology is being done at African sites. The truth is emerging and can no longer be suppressed. And part of this emerging truth is incredibly spiritual. Because Kush was not just a political and economic empire, it was a spiritual empire, a center of religious practice and mystical seeking. The Kushites saw the universe as fundamentally spiritual, believing that physical reality was a manifestation of invisible spiritual forces, that the gods were real and active in the world, that human life had cosmic purpose and sacred meaning. This profoundly spiritual worldview shaped all of Kushite society. Their kings were not just political rulers, but high priests, intermediaries between the gods and humanity. Their Kandake queens were not just military leaders, but embodiments of the mother goddess, earthly manifestations of the divine feminine principle. Their temples were not merely beautiful buildings, but literal portals between worlds, places where the veil between the physical and the spiritual became thin and permeable. The rituals performed in these temples were not empty theater, but spiritual technologies designed to achieve real results: healing, protection, fertility, victory, communication with ancestors and gods. And the Kushites believed that these practices worked, that they were effective, that they produced measurable results in the world. This profound faith in a spiritual reality interconnected with the physical world is something that has been largely lost in the modern materialistic world, but is being rediscovered by people seeking deeper meaning and spiritual connection. The spiritual importance of Kush goes far beyond historical interest, because what the Kushites understood about consciousness, about the cosmos, about the nature of reality, these understandings are timeless and still relevant today. They understood that everything is connected, that human beings are not separate from nature but deeply intertwined with it, that the stars above and the earth below are part of a unified system where everything affects everything. This holistic vision is exactly what many modern thinkers, from ecologists to quantum physicists, are rediscovering through their own lenses. Quantum physics shows that the observer affects the observed, that everything is intertwined at the subatomic level, that reality is much stranger and more interconnected than classical materialism imagined. The Kushites already knew this 3,000 years ago, not through mathematics and experiments, but through direct spiritual perception and contemplative observation. They knew that consciousness is not an accidental byproduct of matter, but a fundamental principle of the universe. They knew that human beings are spiritual beings having a material experience, not material beings who occasionally have spiritual experiences. They knew that death is not the end, but a transition to another state of existence. All these beliefs shaped how the Kushites lived, how they treated each other, how they interacted with nature, how they structured their societies. And all these beliefs are gaining new consideration in the modern world as more people question strict scientific materialism and seek richer and deeper understandings of reality. Kushite spiritual practices involved what we would now call altered states of consciousness. Through fasting, chanting, dancing, meditation, and possibly psychoactive substances of plant origin, Kushite priests and priestesses entered states where they felt direct communion with the divine. In these states, they received visions, messages, and guidance that they then brought back to guide their communities. This is not unlike the shamanism found in indigenous cultures around the world, suggesting that Kush was part of a universal human spiritual tradition that precedes and transcends specific organized religions. This tradition recognizes that ordinary waking consciousness is not the only possible state, that there are other modes of perception accessible through specific practices, and that these alternative states can provide genuine insights unavailable to ordinary consciousness. Modern science is beginning to validate this through research on meditation, psychedelics, and contemplative practices, showing that altered states can have therapeutic value, can increase creativity, can facilitate profound psychological healing, and can genuinely change people's perspectives in positive ways. The Kushites knew all this instinctively and built an entire civilization around these understandings. Their pyramids, precisely positioned, astronomically oriented, and decorated with sacred symbols, were spiritual machines designed to facilitate the soul's journey. The deceased pharaoh, placed inside the pyramid in a carefully constructed chamber, surrounded by religious texts and magical objects, was believed to be undergoing a profound transformation, navigating the underworld, facing spiritual challenges, and eventually being reborn as a divine being capable of interceding for the living. This process was not seen as automatic, but as a perilous journey requiring proper preparation, correct knowledge, and ritual support. The living had obligations to the dead, to make offerings, perform ceremonies, and keep their memory alive. In return, the dead, now transformed into spiritual ancestors, protected and guided the living. This reciprocity between the living and the dead created a community that transcended death, a continuity between generations that gave life greater meaning and purpose. You were not living only for yourself, but as part of a continuous chain stretching from the distant past to the distant future. Your ancestors were watching you, guiding you, and you, in turn, would be an ancestor for future generations. This perspective creates a profound moral responsibility to live worthily because you will become an ancestor whom others will invoke. This ancestral cosmology persists in many traditional African cultures today, demonstrating the durability and resilience of these spiritual ideas. And it is not only Africans who are rediscovering value in these perspectives. People around the world, alienated by modern individualism and materialism, are seeking reconnection with ancestors, with traditions, with something greater than themselves. Kushite spiritual practices offer a model, an example of how an entire society can be organized around spiritual principles without sacrificing sophistication, power, or material prosperity. Kush proves that you can be spiritually profound and materially advanced at the same time, that these things are not contradictory but complementary. People often assume that spirituality means rejecting technology and material progress, returning to some imagined primitive state. But Kush shows that this is false. The Kushites were deeply spiritual and highly technological. They built pyramids that defy even modern engineers and practiced profound mystical rituals. They smelted iron on an industrial scale and worshipped gods in magnificent temples. They conquered empires and sought spiritual enlightenment. All these things coexisted in a harmonious synthesis because they saw everything as part of a unified reality. There was no division between sacred and secular, between spiritual and material. Everything was sacred. Everything had spiritual significance. Everything was part of divine creation and therefore worthy of respect and reverence. So why did you never learn about all this in school? Why does Kush remain virtually unknown while everyone else knows Greece and Rome? The answer is uncomfortable but necessary, because the education system was designed by and for Europeans during the colonial era, and this system deliberately marginalized non-European contributions to civilization. It's not a malevolent conspiracy of specific individuals, but a structural result of centuries of institutionalized Eurocentrism. When the world history curriculum was being developed, European scholars naturally focused on what they considered relevant to their own societies. Greece as the cradle of democracy and philosophy, Rome as the foundation of law and government, Middle Eastern civilizations insofar as they interacted with Europe. Africa was largely ignored except as a setting for European colonization. This biased perspective was then exported to the entire world through colonization and cultural imperialism. Even countries that were never colonized often adopted educational curricula based on European models. The result is that billions of people around the world have learned world history that is actually European history with a few extras. The great non-European civilizations receive brief mentions. China gets a paragraph, India another, pre-Columbian American civilizations perhaps a chapter, but Europe gets volumes. This massive distortion created a false impression that Europeans did everything important in human history, that civilization really means European civilization, that progress is measured by how much you resemble Europe. And within this Eurocentric framework, Africa was especially marginalized because acknowledging advanced African civilizations directly contradicted the racist narrative that justified slavery and colonization. If Africans were capable of building great civilizations, how do you justify enslaving them? How do you justify colonizing them under the pretext of bringing them civilization? You can't. So the solution was to deny that these civilizations existed, or minimize their importance, or attribute them to non-African influences. Kush suffered all these fates. First, it was largely ignored. When it could no longer be ignored due to accumulated archaeological evidence, it was described as a mere copy of Egypt without originality of its own. When even that became untenable, some scholars tried to argue that Kush was created by lighter-skinned Egyptian colonists, not by native black Africans. Each of these positions was refuted by the evidence, but the damage was done. Generations of people grew up without knowing Kush. And even today, when the truth about Kush is known and accepted by serious scholars, the kingdom remains marginal in school curricula. Children still don't learn about Kush in the same way they learn about Rome. Textbooks still dedicate pages to Athens, but only paragraphs to Meroe. This disparity perpetuates ignorance and distorts understanding of human history, because the truth is that Kush is as important as any Mediterranean civilization. During its peak, Kush was more powerful than many of the Greek city-states we revere. The pyramids of Kush are as impressive as any Roman architecture. The warrior Kandakes are as remarkable as any queen or empress we learn about. Meroitic iron production was more advanced than that of many contemporary European societies. By every criterion we use to measure civilizational greatness, Kush qualifies, but it is still treated as a footnote. Changing this requires conscious and deliberate effort. It requires educators to choose to include Kush in their curricula, even if it is not required. It requires writers to create educational materials about Kush in accessible language. It requires producers to make documentaries and films about Kush that capture the public imagination. It requires parents to teach their children about Kush at home if schools do not. And it requires all of us, when we learn about Kush, to share that knowledge, to talk about it, to spread the word. Because knowledge is power, and knowledge of Kush is specifically empowering for people of African descent who have been taught that their ancestors had no noteworthy history. But it is also important for everyone because complete and accurate human history benefits all of humanity. When we understand that great civilizations arose on every continent, developed by people of all colors, expressing the full diversity of human creativity, we gain a deeper appreciation of what it means to be human. We see that there is no superior race or superior culture, but a multiplicity of human expressions, each contributing something unique and valuable to the civilizational tapestry. Kush contributed profound spirituality, impressive architecture, advanced metallurgy, sophisticated political organization, and an inspiring model of powerful female leadership. These contributions enrich the ancient world and continue to inspire the modern world when we take the time to learn about them. And there are practical lessons as well. Kush teaches us about resilience. The kingdom survived for over 1,000 years despite constant pressure from powerful neighbors. It suffered invasions, lost territory, and was forced to adapt repeatedly. But it persisted, maintaining cultural identity and political independence through it all. Eventually, it declined for reasons that are still debated, likely a combination of climate change affecting agriculture, shifts in trade routes that diminished prosperity, and military pressure from emerging neighboring kingdoms. But even in decline, Kush did not disappear completely. Their culture was absorbed and transformed by successor kingdoms in the region. Their descendants continued to live in the same lands. Their spiritual traditions persisted in modified forms. There was no abrupt end, but a gradual transformation, as happens with all civilizations eventually. And now, millennia later, Kush is resurging not as a political state, but as a cultural symbol, as a source of pride and inspiration, as a reminder that Africa has a glorious past that deserves to be remembered and celebrated. Let's talk about the concrete evidence we have about Kush, because it's one thing to talk about greatness abstractly, and quite another to examine the physical evidence that has survived to this day. The pyramids are the most obvious and impressive. In modern-day Sudan, there are 3 main Kushite pyramid sites: Nuri, El Kuru, and Begrawiya, which was ancient Meroe. Together, these sites contain over 200 pyramids, most built between 800 BC and 300 AD, a period of approximately 100 years of continuous pyramid construction. Compare this to Egypt, where pyramid construction essentially ceased after the Middle Kingdom, approximately 1800 BC. This means that Kush was building pyramids more than 1,000 years after the Egyptians stopped, showing cultural continuity and a distinct architectural tradition. Kushite pyramids differ from Egyptian pyramids in several important aspects. They are smaller in size, generally between 20 and 30 meters high compared to the great Egyptian pyramids that reach over 100 meters. But they are much steeper, with an angle of inclination of approximately 70 degrees, compared to the 45 to 50 degrees of the Egyptian pyramids. This pronounced inclination creates structures that literally seem to point to the sky. Each pyramid has an attached funerary chapel on the east face where rituals were performed for the deceased. These chapels often have sculpted reliefs showing the dead being presented to the gods, receiving offerings from descendants, or making a journey to the afterlife. Many of these reliefs have survived remarkably well preserved. providing detailed information about Kushite religious practices, iconography, and artistic style. Unfortunately, virtually all the pyramids were looted in antiquity or the early modern period. Tomb robbers removed treasures, mummies were damaged or destroyed, and many artifacts were lost forever. But even looted pyramids provide valuable information through their architecture, inscriptions, and objects that thieves left behind, and some spectacular discoveries have been made. In 1920, American archaeologist George Reisner excavated pyramids at Nuri and discovered the surprisingly intact tomb of Pharaoh Taharqa, containing a massive granite sarcophagus, Shabti figurines, magical figures intended to serve the dead in the afterlife, and detailed hieroglyphic inscriptions. This discovery provided direct archaeological confirmation of Kushite rule over Egypt and demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of the Kushite elite. More recent excavations using modern technology such as ground-penetrating radar and laser scanning are revealing even more about Kushite pyramids. Many have been found to have more complex underground chambers than previously thought, with multiple rooms and passageways. Some have elaborate drainage systems to cope with rare but occasional desert rains. The attention to architectural detail is impressive considering these structures were built over 2,000 years ago without modern machinery. Beyond the pyramids, Kush left behind magnificent temples. The Temple of Amun at Jebel Barkal, a sacred mountain considered the abode of the god Amun, is particularly impressive. This temple complex was expanded by multiple kings over centuries, each adding new structures and decorations. The main temple has a hypostyle hall with massive columns, spacious courtyards, inner sanctuaries where only priests could enter, and walls covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions and reliefs showing kings making offerings to the gods. Jebel Barkal was not only a religious center but also a political one. Kushite kings were crowned there, state ceremonies were held there, and divine oracles were consulted there for important decisions. The mountain itself has a distinctive shape that Kushites saw as a uraeus, a sacred cobra associated with royalty. This natural formation was interpreted as a sign that the place was especially sacred, chosen by the gods themselves. Archaeologists have also discovered royal palaces that demonstrate the high standard of living of the Kushite elite. The palace at Meroe had over 100 rooms, courtyards decorated with columns, bathrooms with sophisticated plumbing systems, and walls covered with colorful paintings. Discoveries included fragments of imported glass, fine pottery, gold and silver jewelry, all indicating considerable wealth and far-reaching trade connections. Kush traded with Egypt to the north, with African kingdoms to the south and west, with Arabia across the Red Sea, and indirectly through intermediaries with India and even China. This extensive trade network brought wealth, as well as ideas, technologies, and cultural influences that Kush absorbed and adapted. Meroe's iron industry deserves special attention. Archaeologists have identified enormous mounds of slag, the residue of iron smelting, around the ancient city. Estimates suggest that Meroe produced thousands of tons of iron during its peak. This industrial production required complex organization, mining iron ore, collecting fuel, building and operating furnaces, the work of skilled artisans to transform raw iron into tools and weapons, and distribution systems to market finished products. The fact that Kush mastered iron metallurgy so early and on such a scale gave them a significant military and economic advantage. Iron weapons were superior to the bronze weapons used by many enemies. Iron tools allowed for more efficient agriculture and more sophisticated construction, and iron as a commodity could be traded for other valuable goods. Some scholars have speculated that knowledge of ironworking may have spread from Kush to other parts of Africa, making Kush the point of origin for the African Iron Age. While this theory remains debated, it is certainly plausible given Kush's central position and extensive trade connections. Kushite jewelry discovered in tombs and palaces demonstrates exceptional craftsmanship. Gold necklaces with delicately crafted beads, earrings with intricate designs, bracelets decorated with precious stones, all show refined aesthetics and sophisticated technique. Kushites particularly loved to use semi-precious stones such as carnelian, amethyst, and lapis lazuli in their jewelry, creating colorful and vibrant pieces that made bold statements of status and wealth. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence is the still undeciphered Meroitic texts. There are hundreds of Meroitic inscriptions found on funerary stelae, temple walls, votive objects, and even casual graffiti. We know how to read the symbols. We know phonetic values, we can pronounce the words. But we don't fully understand what the words mean because Meroitic is apparently unrelated to any known modern language. It is linguistically isolated, with no direct descendants we could use to work retroactively. Scholars have made progress through comparative methods, looking at proper names that appear in both Meroitic and Egyptian texts, identifying words that repeat in similar contexts, making logical deductions based on patterns. But much of the Meroitic vocabulary remains mysterious. Imagine what we might learn when we finally fully decipher these texts. Detailed stories told by the Kushites themselves in their own words, records of events that Egyptian or classical history never mentioned, religious texts revealing Kushite theology and spiritual practices, literature, poetry, perhaps even philosophy. All of this is there, preserved in stone, waiting for us to finally learn to read it properly. The fact that after decades of study we have not yet completely deciphered Meroitic does not indicate a lack of effort, but rather the complexity of the task. Without an equivalent Rosetta Stone, without an extensive bilingual text that can serve as a key, progress is slow and laborious. But each small advance brings us closer to finally hearing the authentic voice of Kush, not filtered through foreign observers but expressed directly in the words of the Kushites themselves. That will be a transformative day for Kushite studies and for our understanding of African history. Recently, there has been growing interest in Kush from archaeologists and historians, especially from Sudan itself. Sudanese scholars are leading new excavations, re-evaluating ancient discoveries through African rather than European lenses, and working to bring Kushite history to public awareness both locally and internationally. Efforts are being made to preserve Kushite sites that face threats from erosion, modern development, and occasionally armed conflict. Some Kushite sites are listed as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, recognizing their universal importance. But much more could and should be done. Kushite sites deserve the same level of protection, study, and tourism promotion that Egyptian sites receive. Imagine if Kushite pyramids were as famous as the Giza pyramids, if Meroe were as popular a tourist destination as Luxor, if images of warrior Kandakes were as iconic as images of Nefertiti. This is entirely possible because the material is there, the history is fascinating, the monuments are impressive. What is lacking is the will to promote and popularize Kushite history at the same level as Egyptian history. Part of the problem is political. Sudan has gone through decades of instability, civil war, and division into two countries. These conditions hinder systematic archaeology and tourism development. But even in difficult times, Sudanese scholars have worked heroically to protect and study Kushite heritage, and there are signs of positive change. More young Sudanese are becoming interested in their Kushite past, seeing it as a source of national pride and identity. More young Africans and people of African descent globally are discovering Kush and recognizing its importance. Social media is helping to spread knowledge about Kush to audiences who would never have access to specialized academic books. Documentaries are being made, artists are creating works inspired by Kush, educators are developing curricula. Slowly but surely, Kush is emerging from obscurity to the recognition it has always deserved. And this matters not only to history enthusiasts, but to everyone who cares about justice, truth, and honoring the full diversity of human experience. Because every time the history of non-European civilization is properly told, every time the contributions of marginalized peoples are recognized, movement is made toward a more equitable and accurate understanding of our shared past as a species. And Kush is a particularly important piece of this puzzle, because it challenges so many assumptions people make about Africa, about race, about civilization. It is crucial to acknowledge that Black Africans built one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world, comparable in sophistication and achievements to any other. This recognition has implications that go far beyond academic history. It affects how we view modern race relations, how we understand colonialism and its legacies, how we think about development and progress, and how we imagine possible futures. If Africans built Kush in the past, what more can they build in the future? To recognize Kush is to acknowledge the infinite potential and full capacity of African people, past and present. It is to reject racist narratives that portrayed Africans as incapable of advanced civilization. It is to complicate simplistic stories about progress that place Europe at the center. It is to open space for a multiplicity of civilizational paths, each valuable in its own way. Now let's delve even deeper into the spiritual dimension, because this is where Kush truly shines and where deeper lessons can be found for modern spiritual seekers. The Kushite worldview saw the universe as fundamentally ordered, governed by divine principles expressed through gods and goddesses who personified different aspects of reality. Amun was the hidden creative principle, the invisible force that brought everything into existence. Mut was the primordial mother goddess, the matrix of all life. Khonsu was the moon god, a marker of time and traveler through the night sky. Apetamak was the Kushite war lion god, representing royal power and fierce protection. There were dozens of other lesser gods, each with specific domains and functions. But Kushites did not see these gods as completely separate and independent entities. They saw them as manifestations of ultimate divine reality that was too mysterious, too vast to be directly comprehended. Gods were interfaces, ways in which the limited human mind could relate to the infinite. This sophisticated theological understanding is not primitive polytheism, but a recognition that the divine has many faces, many forms, many modes of manifestation. Worshipping Amun did not contradict worshipping Isis, because both were expressions of the same underlying divine power. This theological fluidity allowed Kush to absorb foreign gods when it made sense, syncretize deities when they seemed similar, and maintain a flexible and dynamic pantheon that evolved with the spiritual needs of the people. Kushite ritual practices were elaborate and multisensory. Temples were filled with incense that created an altered atmosphere and induced contemplative states. Chants and music created a soundscape that elevated participants beyond ordinary consciousness. Ritual dances involved bodily movement that expressed devotion and induced ecstasy. Offerings of food, drink, and precious objects established reciprocity with the divine. Humans gave to the gods, gods gave to humans. And behind it all was the belief that these rituals truly worked, that gods truly responded, that prayers were heard and sometimes answered. This faith was not naive. Kushites knew that not every prayer would be answered as desired. They knew that suffering and challenges were part of life, but they believed that through a correct relationship with the divine, life could be navigated with more wisdom, challenges could be faced with more courage, and meaning could be found even in difficulty. Their spiritual practices were not escapism, but a deep engagement with reality in all its dimensions, seen and unseen, material and spiritual. Kushite priests underwent extensive training. Not just anyone could enter the inner sanctuary, perform the most sacred rituals, or interpret omens. It required years of study, spiritual purification, and initiation into mysteries. Priests learned sacred texts, studied celestial movements, practiced divination arts, and developed meditative abilities. They were the intellectual elite of Kushite society, as much as the spiritual elite, and many priests were women. Kush had a strong tradition of powerful priestesses who served female goddesses and sometimes achieved positions of great influence. This openness to female spiritual leadership was remarkable considering that many ancient societies severely restricted the role of women. But Kush recognized the divine feminine principle as equally important to the masculine, and consequently honored women as potential intermediaries of the sacred. The Kandakes were not only political rulers but also religious leaders. They were seen as living embodiments of the goddess, earthly manifestations of divine feminine power. When a Kandake appeared in public in full regalia, she was not just a person but a numinous presence, a meeting point between heaven and earth. This sacralization of female leadership created a unique power dynamic. Women were not fighting for recognition within a structure defined by men. They had their own space, their own power, their own authority derived from fundamental theological principles. Of course, reality was certainly more complex, and politics always involves negotiation and competition. But the ideal was clear. The divine feminine was as essential as the divine masculine, and women could be channels of sacred power as much as men. For modern spiritual seekers, especially women, Kush offers an alternative model to the patriarchal structures that have dominated many religious traditions. It shows that the worship of the divine feminine and female spiritual leadership are not modern inventions, but have deep ancient roots. It shows that societies can organize themselves around spiritual principles that honor both masculine and feminine, both yang and yin, both sun and moon. and it shows that power can be exercised with grace, strength can be combined with compassion, and governance can be informed by spiritual wisdom. The Kandakes ruled not only through military force but through moral authority derived from their perceived connection to the divine. When making decisions, they were seen as channeling divine will, not merely following personal preferences. This placed tremendous responsibility upon them, to govern justly because gods were watching, to treat subjects with compassion because each person was sacred, to seek wisdom because governing was a spiritual act. Of course, not every Kandake lived up to these ideals. Power corrupts, and undoubtedly there were Kushite rulers who abused their authority. But the ideal remains inspiring. Leadership as spiritual service, power as sacred responsibility, governance as spiritual practice. The Kushite perspective on death and the afterlife offers profound insights that resonate with many modern spiritual traditions. Kushites did not see death as an end, but as a transition, a passage from one state of existence to another. The physical body was temporary, a vehicle for the soul during earthly life. When the body died, the soul continued its journey, navigating through spiritual realms, eventually reaching a place of rest, or possibly being reborn. This view of the continuity of consciousness beyond physical death is found in many spiritual traditions around the world. From Hinduism and Buddhism, with their doctrines of reincarnation, to indigenous beliefs about ancestors who remain present and active even after bodily death. Kushites shared this understanding. Death did not annihilate a person, but transformed them. And this transformation was not automatic, but required preparation, correct rituals, and appropriate knowledge. The funerary texts placed in Kushite tombs were guides, maps for navigating the afterlife. They contained spells for protection against spiritual dangers, passwords to past gatekeepers, and instructions for judgment where life's actions were weighed and measured. This concept of post-mortem judgment is particularly interesting. Kushites believed that after death the soul was brought before a divine tribunal where the deceased's heart was weighed against the feather of truth, representing Ma'at, the principle of order, justice, and balance. If the heart was weighed by wickedness, it would be devoured and the soul destroyed. If the heart was in balance, the soul would be justified and allowed to proceed to a blissful existence. This was not an arbitrary judgment, but a moral evaluation based on how the person lived. Did they treat others with kindness? Did they act justly? Did they maintain Ma'at in their life? These were the questions that mattered. Wealth and status did not count in the spiritual judgment. King and peasant were equally responsible for living righteously. This spiritual democratization coexisted with a rigid social hierarchy in earthly life, creating an interesting tension, socially unequal, but spiritually equal before the gods. This belief in moral accountability had practical effects. It encouraged ethical behavior because actions had consequences not only in this life, but in the next. It provided solace to the oppressed who could believe that earthly injustices would be rectified in divine judgment. And it gave purpose to life, to live in a way that would pass the final judgment, to cultivate a righteous heart, to uphold Ma'at. For moderns struggling with questions of meaning and morality in a world often presented as purposeless, the Kushite worldview offers structure. It suggests that actions have weight, that morality is not arbitrary but aligned with cosmic order, that how we live matters not only to ourselves and others around us, but on a larger spiritual scale. You don't need to literally believe in weighing the heart to appreciate the underlying insight. Living with integrity, treating others justly, seeking balance and harmony. These are universally recognized virtues that transcend specific cultures or religions. Kushites place them at the center of their spirituality. Another fascinating aspect of Kushite spirituality is the deep connection with nature. The Nile River was seen not only as a resource, but as a sacred presence, a giver of life whose annual flood brought fertility. The desert was seen as the domain of mysterious forces, a place of testing and transformation. The night sky was observed reverently, stars seen as manifestations of gods or the souls of transformed ancestors. Animals were respected, many associated with specific deities: lion with Aphrodite, snake with royalty, falcon with Horus, cow with Hathor. This animism, seeing sacredness in nature, is another common characteristic of indigenous spiritualities that is being rediscovered by environmentalists and modern spiritual seekers. In a world facing ecological crisis, there is a growing recognition that we need to recover a sense of reverence for nature, to see the earth as sacred, not just as a resource to be exploited. Kushites had this reverence embedded in their worldview. They did not separate the spiritual from the natural. Everything was part of a unified divine creation. This holistic perspective is an antidote to the dualism that has characterized much Western thought, the division between spirit and matter, sacred and profane, human and nature. Kush reminds us that these divisions are artificial. Reality is an integrated totality where everything is connected, where the spiritual permeates the material, where the sacred can be found in all things. The meditative and contemplative practices of Kushite priests also deserve attention. Although specific details have not survived in written records, circumstantial evidence suggests that altered states of consciousness were cultivated. Temple structures include small chambers where priests could isolate themselves for contemplation. Texts mention divine revelations received by priests. Art shows priests in postures that suggest meditation or trance. All indications are that, like other ancient spiritual traditions, Kush developed techniques to quiet the mind, open perception to more subtle dimensions of reality, and enter into communion with the divine through direct experience rather than just intellectual belief. These contemplative practices are universally human, found in all cultures and all eras. They are experiencing a significant resurgence today through the popularity of meditation, mindfulness, yoga, and other disciplines that cultivate altered states of consciousness. People are discovering what Kushite priests knew millennia ago. There is more to reality than the material surface. There are depths that can be explored through inner practices. There is wisdom that comes from silence and stillness as much as from words and concepts. If you've made it this far, it means you're genuinely interested in understanding how Kushite history can be applied to your real life today, how lessons from ancient civilization can have practical relevance in the 21st century. And I guarantee there are profound applications if we're willing to look beyond the historical surface to underlying principles. First, Kush teaches us about cultural resilience. Despite immense pressures from powerful neighbors, despite conquests and defeats, despite economic and environmental changes, Kush maintained a distinct identity for over 1,000 years. This ability to adapt without losing essence is incredibly relevant today when cultures around the world are navigating the tension between globalization and preserving unique identity. African communities and African diasporas especially face the challenge of maintaining cultural connections while participating in the modern world. Kush shows that it's possible to do both. Kushites adopted elements of Egyptian culture when useful, but never became merely Egyptian. They developed their own writing, their own artistic style, their own political traditions, while still trading with and learning from neighbors. This balance between openness and cultural integrity is a valuable model. Second, the female leadership of the Kandake dynasty offers inspiration for women today, seeking power and influence in societies still often dominated by men. The Kandake women did not wait for permission, did not apologize for their ambition, and did not limit themselves to supporting roles. They ruled absolutely, fought fiercely, and boldly built monuments. They did this not despite being women, but through a theological framework that honored divine feminine principles. Modern women may not have this supporting theological framework in their societies, but they can draw inspiration from historical examples. If Kushite women could lead armies and rule empires 2,000 years ago, surely women today can claim any leadership position they desire. The story of Amanirenas defeating Rome is particularly powerful. Never underestimate the power of a determined woman fighting for her people and land. Third, the Kushite spiritual approach offers an alternative to secular materialism that leaves many modern people feeling empty and disconnected. Kushites saw the world as enchanted, permeated by divine presence, rich in meaning and purpose. Each person had a soul that would continue beyond death. Every action had moral significance. Every aspect of nature deserved respect and reverence. This worldview creates a sense of belonging and meaning that many modern spiritual seekers desire. You don't literally need to worship Amun or Isis to appreciate the value of seeing the world as fundamentally spiritual, of treating nature with reverence, of believing that there is more to reality than matter and random movement. Kush invites us to recover a sense of wonder, to reconnect with the spiritual dimension of existence, to live with the awareness that we participate in something greater than ourselves. Fourth, the Kushite model of cultural syncretism and theological openness is relevant to an increasingly pluralistic world. Kushites saw no contradiction in worshiping multiple deities, absorbing foreign gods, and syncretizing different traditions. They understood that divine truth was too vast to be captured by a single system, that different paths could lead to the same ultimate spiritual destination. In a world today divided by religious conflict and intolerance, this Kushite openness is refreshing and instructive. It suggests that we can honor our own tradition while respecting others, that we can learn from different spiritual paths without betraying our own commitments, that religious diversity can be a source of richness rather than conflict. Fifth, Kushite technological sophistication combined with spiritual depth challenges the false dichotomy between spirituality and material progress. Kushites smelted iron and worshipped gods. They built mathematically precise pyramids and performed mystical rituals. They traded internationally and maintained deep spiritual traditions, all at the same time, all integrated. This contradicts the modern narrative that often presents a choice between being spiritual and primitive or being technological and secular. Kush proves that synthesis is possible, that we can have advanced technology and a rich spiritual life, that material progress does not require abandoning spiritual values. In fact, an argument could be made that more sustainable and humane progress comes precisely when technological development is guided by spiritual wisdom and ethical principles. Sixth, Kush heritage has practical application in education. Incorporating Kushite history into curricula is not just about representation, although that is important. It's about providing all students, not just Africans, with a more accurate and complete understanding of human history. Students who learn about Kush learn that civilization arose independently in multiple places, that human innovation is not the exclusive property of any one culture, and that greatness comes in many forms. This knowledge cultivates humility, open-mindedness, and appreciation for diversity. It prepares students to live in a globalized world where they will need to interact with people from all backgrounds. And specifically for African and Afro-descendant students, learning about Kush provides a powerful counter-narrative to racist messages they may absorb from the wider society. When a black child learns that ancestors built pyramids, founded empires, developed writing, and created magnificent art, this strengthens self-esteem and a sense of possibility. History matters not only as a record of the past, but as a mold for imagining futures. Seventh, communal aspects of Kushite society offer lessons on social organization. Despite hierarchy, there was a sense of mutual responsibility. Kings were accountable to the gods for the well-being of their subjects. The wealthy had religious obligations of charity. The community extended beyond the living to include deceased ancestors who remained part of the social network. This emphasis on interconnectedness and mutual responsibility contrasts with the atomized individualism that characterizes many modern societies where community connections have weakened. There is a growing recognition that humans are social beings who thrive in community. That isolation causes psychological suffering, and that we need to recover a sense of belonging and mutual responsibility. The Kushite model of community, which includes the living and the dead, sees each person as part of a larger social web and balances individual autonomy with collective responsibility, offering valuable insights. Let me ask you some direct questions now. How do you feel when you discover that there was a great African civilization that is rarely taught about? How does this change your understanding of history? Can you see how historical narratives have been shaped by biases and political agendas? And more importantly, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you share it with others? Will you seek to learn more? Will you question other assumptions you have made about history and culture? Because learning about Kush is not just accumulating historical facts. It is an invitation to rethink much of what we assume about the past, present, and future. It is an invitation to question the authority of dominant historical narratives that exclude or marginalize non-European contributions. It is an invitation to seek forgotten histories, silenced voices, erased civilizations, and it is an invitation to recognize the full humanity and capacity of all peoples, regardless of race, region, or era. When we acknowledge that Black Africans built Kush, when we honor Kandakas as great leaders, when we appreciate the spiritual sophistication of Kushite religion, when we admire the skill of Kushite artisans and engineers, we are fundamentally affirming the dignity and capability of African people. And this affirmation has implications that go far beyond ancient history. It affects how we think about Africa today, how we view the continent's challenges and potential, how we imagine African futures. If Africans built Kush in the past, they can certainly build great things in the future. Obstacles that Africa faces today are not the result of some inherent deficiency, but of centuries of colonial exploitation, arbitrary borders imposed by European powers, continuous resource extraction, and foreign interference in internal affairs. These are real and serious obstacles, but they are not insurmountable. Kush's history reminds us that Africans have a deep well of creativity, resilience, and wisdom to draw upon. Reclaiming this history is part of a larger process of decolonization, not only politically but mentally and spiritually. Decolonizing the mind means questioning colonial narratives we have internalized, rejecting racist assumptions we have absorbed, and reclaiming suppressed histories and identities. Kush is a powerful tool in this process, and for non-African people, learning about Kush is also transformative. It challenges the Eurocentrism that shapes Western education. It expands understanding of human civilizational diversity. It cultivates cultural humility and openness to different ways of organizing society, expressing spirituality, and creating art and architecture. Kush invites us all, regardless of background, to more fully appreciate the richness and complexity of human experience throughout history. So in very practical terms, how can you apply all of this? Start by educating yourself. Read books about Kush written by reputable scholars. There are excellent resources available, although you need to actively seek them out because they won't be promoted as heavily as books about European civilizations. Watch documentaries. Visit museums that have Kushite collections if possible. And crucially, share what you learn. Talk to friends and family about Kush. Mention it in conversations when relevant. If you are an educator, incorporate Kush into your curriculum. If you are a parent, teach your children about Kush. If you are in media or entertainment, consider creating content about Kush. Every person who learns about Kush and shares that knowledge is part of the process of bringing this forgotten history back into the collective consciousness. And on a more personal and spiritual level, reflect on Kushite spiritual principles. Are you drawn to the idea of seeing the world as fundamentally spiritual and interconnected? Do contemplative practices resonate with you? Does the concept of moral responsibility that extends beyond this life appeal to you? Does reverence for nature make sense to you? You don't need to literally become a worshiper of a moon to incorporate Kushite spiritual wisdom into your life. You can simply allow these ideas to inform your own spiritual journey, whatever it may be. You can cultivate more reverence for nature, more awareness of interconnectedness, more sense of moral responsibility, more openness to spiritual dimensions of reality. You can look to Kandaks as models of strong and compassionate leadership. You can draw inspiration from Kushite cultural resilience as you navigate your own tensions between tradition and change. And crucially, one can refuse to accept incomplete or biased historical narratives. One can commit to seeking complete history, including voices and perspectives that have been marginalized. One can become a student of real global history, not just European history disguised as world history. This commitment to historical truth is an act of justice and also an act of personal growth. Because the more fully we understand the human past, the more wisely we can navigate the present and imagine the future. We've reached the end of this profound journey through the history and spirituality of Kush. And if you're here now, if you've watched this far, that says something important about you. It says you're genuinely interested in truth, that you're willing to question narratives you've received, that you value knowledge that goes beyond the surface. And that's rare and precious. So let's recap what we've discovered. We learned that Kush was a sacred kingdom of Africa, a Black African civilization that existed for over 1,000 years south of Egypt in what is now Sudan. We learned that Kush built over 200 pyramids, more than Egypt itself, pyramids that still stand today, bearing witness to a grandeur that has been systematically erased from history books. We discovered that Kush not only rivaled Egypt, but conquered and ruled Egypt for almost a century, with Black Kushite pharaohs sitting on the pharaoh's throne, and governing an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. We learned about the Kandakes, warrior queens of Kush who led armies, defeated Rome, and ruled with absolute power at a time when most women in the world had few rights. We discovered that Kush developed an iron industry on a scale that rivaled anything in the ancient world, created its own writing system that has not yet been fully deciphered, and built cities, palaces, and temples of impressive sophistication. We learned that Kush was a profound spiritual center where religion was not just belief but living practice, where temples were portals between worlds, where kings were considered living gods, and every aspect of life was permeated by spiritual awareness. We discovered that this magnificent civilization was deliberately erased by European colonial historians who could not accept that Black Africans created something so advanced, so they minimized, distorted, or completely ignored evidence of Kushite greatness. And we learned that today, through modern archaeology and dedicated scholars, especially Africans, recovering their own history, the truth about Kush is finally emerging. This knowledge is not only academically interesting, it is profoundly transformative. For people of African descent, Kush is irrefutable proof of ancestral greatness, a root of pride and identity, a counter-narrative to centuries of racism that attempted to deny Africa its place in human civilization. For everyone, Kush is a reminder that human history is far more diverse and complex than Eurocentric curricula have taught us, that great civilizations arose on every continent, that the contributions of non-European peoples were vast and essential to collective human development. And spiritually, Kush offers timeless wisdom about the interconnectedness of all things, about moral responsibility that transcends this life, about reverence for nature, about the possibility of leadership that integrates political power with spiritual depth. So what will you do with all this? This knowledge is now yours. You can keep it to yourself, add it to your personal understanding of the world, and move on. Or you can share it, spread it, become part of a growing movement bringing Kush and other forgotten African civilizations back to public consciousness. Every person who learns and shares makes a difference. If you've stayed this far, if this video impacted you, show it by liking it now. Seriously, click that like button because it helps this content reach more people who need to hear this truth. And subscribe to the channel because we're going to continue delving into forgotten stories, hidden truths, and profound spiritual knowledge that the mainstream ignores. There's much more to come. In the comments, I want you to write a specific word so I know you really watched until the end. Write Kushita if you stayed this far, if this journey impacted you, if you're ready to be part of a movement reclaiming true African history. And after commenting Kushita, tell me, what part of this story impacted you the most? Was it discovering about Kushite pyramids, about warrior Kandakes, about the conquest of Egypt, about profound spirituality? Share your thoughts because the community we're building here is about real dialogue, true engagement, and collective learning. And if you really want to continue this journey, look at the screen now because another video is appearing that will take you even deeper into the mysteries of ancient Africa, revelations that will continue to expand your consciousness and challenge everything you thought you knew about human history. Click on it now. Don't wait, because the learning momentum you have now is precious. Use it. Keep digging deeper. Keep discovering truths. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having an open mind to receive this knowledge. Thank you for being part of something bigger. Kush has been forgotten for centuries but will not be anymore. Together we are bringing this story back to light where it belongs. See you in the next video.